Thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm so delighted to be here. And to just talk poetry in life. I'm excited for the conversation. I thought I would, well actually I was told to read some poems first, so I will do that. I was kind of thinking, what have I been thinking and professing about poetry lately? And I think the one thing that I've really felt compelled to try and remind people of is that poetry is one route back to the inner voice that we all have. And I think the inner voice is the thing that connects us to our larger selves, our wiser selves, the selves that know more than we do. And there's so much in our lives at this moment that is actively or accidentally drowning that inner voice out. And I think it's dangerous. And so I feel like poetry is not a luxury. I feel like it's a necessity. It's one thing that allows us to touch base with something that is eternal. So I thought I would read a few poems from Life on Mars, in which I'm thinking in maybe curious and abstract terms about who we are, what we're connected to. I have this belief that we knew these answers at some point, and poetry is a way of trying to remember what they are. This is a poem called The Weather in Space, and it opens the book. Is God being or pure force? The wind or what commands it? When our lives slow and we can hold all that we love, it sprawls in our laps like a gangly doll. When the storm kicks up and nothing is ours, we go chasing after all we're certain to lose, so alive, faces radiant with panic. There are a lot of sort of unnamed spaces in this book. It's a book in which I was thinking in some terms about America, about the future that we are paving the way for better and mostly for worse, I think. And then there are these other poems that are trying to imagine, what are we actually about? Where do we come from? So I'm going to read a couple of those poems. This is one called The Largeness We Can't See. I started to say that because sometimes that unnamed space is God in these poems. Sometimes it's just a nebulous it. My imagination wants to believe that whatever this thing is, it's systematic. And so these poems are an attempt to kind of create a kind of momentary order. This is called The Largeness We Can't See. When our laughter skids across the floor, like beads yanked from some girl's throat, what waits where the laughter gathers? And later, when our saw-toothed breaths lay us down on a bed of leaves, what feeds with ceaseless focus on the leaves? It's solid, yet permeable, like a mood. Like God, it has no face. Like lust, it flickers on without a prick of guilt. We move in and out of rooms, leaving our dust, our voices pooled on sills. We hurry from door to door in a downpour of days. Old trees inch up, their trunks thick with new rings. All that we see grows into the ground, and all we live blind to leans its deathless heft to our ears and sings. The soul. The voice is clean, has heft, like stones dropped in still water or tossed one after the other at a low wall, chipping away at what pushes back, not always making a dent, but keeping at it. And the silence around it is a door punched through with light, a garment that attests to breasts, the privacy between thighs. The body is what we lean toward, tensing as it darts, dancing away. But it's the voice that enters us, even saying nothing over and over absently to itself. Sometimes I think that that's my definition of poetry. It's that crucial voice saying nothing over and over absently to itself. I think my questions are the same. What do we belong to? What are we? But in Wade in the Water, the site where those questions are being asked is more concrete. I'm looking at history. I guess I'm thinking about nationhood or citizenship or all the opportunities that we have to acknowledge one another and what we do with those opportunities. This is a poem called Declaration, and it was written by my reading the Declaration of Independence and deleting most of it. And when I describe it like that, it sounds actually deliberate and intentional. But what is more honest is that I sat down to read the Declaration of Independence, and certain lines leapt out at me with a huge kind of emphasis, as though they were trying to make themselves heard differently. So this is that version of the document. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. A lot of the history that I've been looking at in building these poems is history of slavery in this country, the founding documents, and the tremendous contradiction that lives within them. I think that those facets of Americanness continue to befuddle us. And it seemed at one point that history was so far in the past, and now it doesn't feel that way to me anymore. This is a poem that I wrote thinking about what it feels like to belong to a country, and many different kinds of people feel this, but to belong to a country that doesn't claim you, or that doesn't trust you. I wrote that poem, and I couldn't figure out what to call it. I put it away for a little while, and then it hit me. This is "The United States Welcomes You." Why and by whose power were you sent? What do you see that you may wish to steal? Why this dancing? Why do your dark bodies drink up all the light? What are you demanding that we feel? Have you stolen something? then what is that leaping in your chest? What is the nature of your mission? Do you seek to offer a confession? Have you anything to do with others brought by us to harm? Then why are you afraid? And why do you invade our night, hands raised, eyes wide, mute as ghosts? Is there something you wish to confess? Is this some enigmatic type of test? What if we fail? How and to whom do we address our appeal? And then there's a thread of poems that are kind of trying to learn what it might feel like to embody compassion. So I'll end with this poem, which is called Refuge. And it came out of a conference I attended at Princeton University where I teach, a conference on forced migration. Refuge. Until I can understand why you fled, why you are willing to bleed, why you deserve what I must be willing to cede, let me imagine you are my mother in Montgomery, Alabama, walking to campus rather than riding the bus. I know what they call you, what they try to convince you you lack. I know your tired ankles, the sudden thunder of your laugh. Until I want to give you what I myself deserve, let me love you by loving her. Your sister in a camp in Turkey, 16, deserving of everything. Let her be my daughter, who has curled her neat hands into fists, insisting nothing is fair, and I have never loved her. Naomi, lips set in a scowl, young heart ransacking its cell. Let me lend her passion to your sister and love her for her living rage, her need for more, and now, and all. Let me leap from sleep if her voice sounds out, afraid, from down the hall. I've seen men like your father walking up Harrison Street now that the days are getting longer. Let me love them as I love my own father, whom I phoned once from a valley in my life to say what I feared I'd never adequately said. Voice choked, stalled, hearing the silence spread around us like weather. What would it cost me to say it now to a stranger's father, walking home to our separate lives together? Thank you.
Amazing. Wow. Look at all these poetry lovers. My name is Marvin K. White, and just a little context about my provocations for this evening. They come out of the pure joy that I experienced reading Tracy's work. And these are love questions to her work. And you need to know that I think Tracy is the Oracle from The Matrix. She gave me a choice. She had cookies. Can we start with your cadence and the speed at which you read? No, that wasn't. But experiencing your work slowed me down. I'm used to rushing to the bottom of the page to get it finished, but your work and listening to your voice while I read, like, lowered my heart rate, you know? So how did you come to your reading voice?
I used to read, like when I first started giving readings after the publication of my first book, I guess I read very quickly. And a friend said, you should record yourself so you can hear what you sound like. And I did, and I was like, oh my gosh, I want the poems to have a little bit more space to mean.
Yeah.
And so I learned to slow down a little bit. And I didn't realize how much I had slowed down until more recently, listening to, you know, recordings. And I realized, oh, have you slowed this recording down? No, that's how you talk. I think I read poems hoping to lose myself in them, hoping to make use of every word and space and opportunity for thought.
Yeah.
And I think the way that I read them out loud enacts that a little bit.
Yeah,
I think it's important for us to change that rate at which we're operating, because we miss too much.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a voice we come with, and then the voice we find for ourselves. Most of the time, our pace is not our own. You know, so poetry helps you to find your pace in life. What is the importance of being a poet in 2019?
I think it's huge. I gave a talk a year ago about technology and humanity and my own anxiety that the ease and facility and quickness with which we are moving through the world is detaching us from something that we need. And then, you know, there's a whole other element that has to do with the language that comes with that. And I think poetry is one of the many things that helps us find our way back to something that's not driven by a consumer model, that's not merely utilitarian, and that is seeking to make connections rather than discard things. So being a poet right now, I think, feels amazing.
Yeah.
This is one of the first times when it doesn't feel to me like what poets are saying belongs in like a private or marginal space. I feel like poets writing right now are thinking in creative and courageous terms about the world that we've made. And it's not the language of policy.
Yeah.
It's not the language of political debate, but it speaks to some of those same problems, and it encourages us to use different and I think even better faculties to kind of ponder things.
That's good. You, in the comments you wrote about your podcast, you said poetry isn't an escape or even a luxury. I'd argue it's a necessity, a means of living more deeply with reality. How, in this moment where everything is about the virtual reality and to destabilize our reality, how does poetry keep us in the real?
I think it does it in a lot of ways. I mean, sometimes when I say I'm a poet, people say, oh, you must know the names of trees and things. And, you know, in one way, poetry does make you look at the world, at the real world, and pay close attention to it. I kind of lost my way from your question. Could you? I got distracted by the laughter.
The story of my life. In this moment where this administration, this system is hell-bent on keeping us in the virtual, you know, how does poetry keep us in the real?
Yeah, well, the other better, like, realer thing, or I think more emphatic thing is poetry, when you read a poem, even if it's written by a poet who's writing in the voice of someone who never existed, you're entering into a life, a subjectivity, a set of experiences that have left a mark. And your instincts, your sense of logic and order are not the governing principles at work. And so you're submitting to this other person's experience. oftentimes it's not a fictional person, but it's a real person who's kind of bearing witness in some way. And I feel like there's nothing more important than that. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, I belong to this demographic, I'm interested in these things, but it's another to say, oh, I am here right now with you. We are two people, and I know that there are things you felt that will make sense to me. I want to hear what they are. I want to learn from them. That's not a virtual act.
Yeah. One of the things when we were talking to the students earlier, you look for the question in the poems. You know, how do you know when a poem that's coming to you has a question that you want to explore?
Well, sometimes the poem is triggered by a question that I have in real life. Like some of the first poems I read come from those large kind of abstract questions. But sometimes it's like, oh gosh, I didn't know that this event happened in the world. What can I learn about it? And a poem helps me to do the research and to find a perspective within it. Other times the questions emerge midway through a poem because I don't know what to say. I don't have any answers. I don't even have anything that I'm aware of wanting to describe. And so I make space for the actual questions in my head.
Is it ever bi-directional? Do poetry have questions for you, or you just have questions for poetry?
Well, I think when I read poems that ask questions, I learn something. It's funny, like a question is always an invitation for you to kind of do a little bit of thinking, right? So when a poem asks something, I'm not just waiting for the poet to answer that question. My mind is racing ahead thinking, oh, right, could it be, is there? Maybe there's not a fixed answer, but I've gone a little distance into the idea. And that's one of the favorite experiences I have as a reader.
Great. We were just talking earlier about the poem History. There's a line in the poem that speaks about a poem lying to you. How do you know when a poem is lying to you?
Well, in that poem, that's a poem that's thinking. I wanted to write a long poem about America, and a poem that had to do with dissatisfaction, atomization, and a lot of different things. And so there's a moment where the poem is almost like an adversary or something. It's telling you it's okay, it's fine, everything's all right. And then, you know, the poem says that a poem can lie.
Yeah.
And then there's another moment where the poem has questions. But I think a poem is lying when it isn't willing to admit to what's truly at stake. Sometimes it's because it's hard to be vulnerable. Sometimes because it's more exciting or satisfying to be funny or clever. And so the poem resorts merely to doing things to elicit a response in the reader, instead of, you know, like putting its body on the line. Like what's in my heart? What can I get off my chest that could free me in some way?
Yeah.
Those are the poems that tell the truth, I think. Of course, that's subjective, but that's my sense of poems that lie.
Yeah.
They're hiding something.
Yeah. The oracle. Get into it. How about some process questions? You talked about research. What's the role of research in a poem? I think there's an idea that poems come to you fully formed and grown with a note around its neck. This is how you raised me.
Please take care of this poem. Yeah, well, like everything else, it's work. And if I want to write a poem about civil war in Uganda, which I once did, I need to learn something about that. And it's not going to be a Wikipedia entry. It's going to be, where can I find, what experiences am I interested in trying to the extent possible, which obviously is limited, but trying to grasp a little bit better. What voices and stories can I read and listen to that can give me something to ask and say back to about this, you know? I think it's like, like so much. We've got to learn a little bit before we can even know what questions to ask.
Yeah, in your, in the poems, the epistle and epistolary poems, you really go back, you know, and find the voices and the question that these people had. What was it like going back? Because you go forward. And thank you, by the way, for letting me know that Black people make it out alive. That there is life on Mars for us. What was it like going backwards and going forward?
Well, what I love about poetry is that time. Okay, so I have little kids, and every day I get them up and get them ready for school. We have the same amount of time every day, and they don't believe in time. It's not a construct that they have agreed to.
Yeah.
And they're free.
Yeah.
The bus is out there. It doesn't matter. You know, they're free. Time is something that we kind of accept the burden of when we get a little bit older. And it cuts us off from so much. And I think art is one space where time is malleable.
Yeah.
It's elective even. You can choose to go backward. You can choose to stay in place and dig into a never-ending present.
Yeah.
You can speculate about the future. If that sounds weird, think about how film works,
Yeah.
right? We have flashbacks, we have flash forwards, we have these things where things are cross-cut, and that makes a kind of intuitive sense. Poems do that too.
Yeah. So for the writers in the room, how do you start a poem? And how do you stay in the poem? And how do you leave the poem?
Sometimes I start a poem because there is something on my mind that I know I want to explore. If it's that kind of a poem, I usually have a question or an image or statement on my tongue, and that's how I start. And then I move forward from there by saying, okay, what have I just said? What does it sound like? What pictures does it kind of paint? And how can I build upon those things? And I move forward like that, looking for like a little toehold here and there, and until a kind of momentum accrues and the poem is pushing me somehow to recognize certain things. Sometimes I start a poem because I want to write, but I don't have anything that I need to say. And those are the days when I'm happy that it's a solo process, because I'm sitting there saying dumb things on my computer until one thing doesn't sound quite so dumb. And I know I can work with that.
Right. So much life in you and so many lives you lived. The institution of life is that it leaves you. How do you love life like you do, you know, in your writing?
I love that question. The institution of life is that it leaves you. Yeah, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
How do I love life?
Yeah. Because you were looking for it. You were, you know, whether the one your mother had designed for you, you were running in the opposite direction to find yours, or just listen out for it, you know. And then it ended up on the page.
I think, you know, having kids makes me see things so differently. I think we come here, we are born with a particular way of loving life. And we find our way into the ability to you know, use that.
Yeah.
I feel lucky that I have had people who loved me and let me find me. I feel lucky that I had the luxury of silence in my life growing up, to look at things and think about them, to play, because I think that's a big part of also why we're here. Certainly it's a big part of making art. And I feel like the pain that is a part of every life teaches us things that we need, you know, even though it's awful. And I guess I'm willing to I became willing to kind of learn from that and be grateful for it in some way.
That's good. I'm wondering about your relationship to God. And I know there's the idea that God teaches us, but I also believe that you taught God something. Do you know what you taught God?
Oh gosh, I love that question for so many reasons, but there's one reason that's going to make me sound sort of crazy, but why not? One of the things I love to read when I feel overwhelmed are the narratives of people who have had near-death experiences. Not like, oh, I was almost hit by a bus, but I was hit by a bus and I died for 3 minutes and I went somewhere and something happened. A lot of people who come back from these experiences have similar perspectives, and one that I find so beautiful and poetic is that they understand that we are here to teach God what life in this form is, what all the possibilities of experience are, what it feels like to be cruel, what it feels like to love, what it feels like to suffer, all of that stuff. I love that because it makes sense of something that otherwise wouldn't make sense. So I guess in that way I'm teaching God, you know, all the silly, dumb things that make up my life, what that feels like. And I don't know. There are so many of my poems that are about notions of God. God is, you know, almost like a David Bowie person, or God is, you know, this celestial math thing, or God is a fox in a field, or something like that. And maybe those possibilities could be of interest to whatever is out there.
Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite memories from the memoir is you, like, finding your shape in the crook of your mother's bent knees on the couch. Like, you just bent into that shape. I mean, that was God, you know, in that moment. Maybe a question about literary ancestry. Like, who are your literary ancestors? Or who signed your literary birth certificate?
Oh gosh, a lot of people that I wasn't aware of until I was made aware of how much I owe them. You know, like, I've written about how one of the first poems that spoke to me was an Emily Dickinson poem. I didn't realize how much her work has shaped me until I see lines or perspectives that I've really stolen in poems, or somebody says, oh, that, you know, you use eternity in a way that Dickinson does. That's exciting to me. You see the genetic, you know, like similarity or something from the poets that you love. Lucille Clifton is one of those poets for me. She is able, her work is able, she was able to look out toward the cosmic, you know, that which is not human, and also dig deep into, you know, the smallest instances of being human and being black and being alive. And her work is so profound, I think. I wanted to become, one of the reasons I wanted to write poetry was because of reading Seamus Heaney when I was 19 in college, and loving the way that his poems made me feel like I knew what it felt like to dig in the gravelly soil in Northern Ireland, or, you know what it felt like to belong to a big family like his. And Elizabeth Bishop is another poet whose work I feel around my own work, within my own work. She's this master of description, and that, I believe, the purpose that those beautiful descriptions of the actual world serve for her is to allow her to ask something of that, like change me, startle me, help me. There's a deep vulnerability in her poems that I really, as I get older, I hear and I value. There's so many. I mean, I love peers like Kevin Young, Terrence Hayes. I love people who were models on the page for me, like Elizabeth Alexander. When I was in college, I was trying to steal Rita Dove's book, Thomas and Beulah, you know, trying to write that in my own voice. It's it's a big family tree.
Yeah. Speaking of poetic family trees, can you tell the people about Cave Canem and its impact on your writing?
Yeah. Cave Canem is an organization that describes itself as a home for Black poetry. And it was founded about 25 years ago, I think, or 20 years ago, by Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady, two poets, who understood that then, and it's still true now, there's not always a sense of safety, interest, respect, curiosity that Black poets are made to feel in workshops. Oh, I can't relate to that, you know, private cultural marker. Maybe you should take it out of your poem. Maybe you should change it. So that organization was like, no. We're part of a tradition. We're going to honor it. And in the 20 years since it's existed, I feel like Cave Canem has totally revitalized, changed, and frankly saved American poetry from, you know, ossification. I'll say that. I've said that before. Because there's a new body of energy, people with lineages like the one I just described, and others who are writing about family, self, politics, hope, place, and changing the many different chords that American poetry has found to strike. I personally feel like what Black poetry has done for poetry is what Black life could do for America, if America would let it.
Yeah, that's good. I think the best thing about being a Cave Canem Fellow is that everyone you meet has already done your ancestry for you. Like your tree just expands with everybody because the interest and the input of each poet is so different. You know, I know there's an idea of Black poetry, but it's so big and wide. It's like all the colors sucked into Blackness. That makes Blackness. How are we doing?
Good on time.
Thank you. I'm interested in poetics, citizenship, and gender. The question is not that deep.
Sounded like grad school for me.
I went to seminary, and so these are all like seminarian questions. In the various poetry worlds that you are a citizen of or a visitor of, do you find that there is a kindness to Black women poets?
Yes.
And the spaces that you are welcomed in, what does that feel like, and how do you know that there's a welcome and an expectation that you're going to come in and be an equal and share work?
That's a good question. I like the spaces where we're all there for that sense of awe, magic, surprise that poetry can foster, and we're not there for any ego-based goal. I like the spaces where it's not about, and there are these spaces where it's like poetry business and you're operating, and I like the spaces where we're just kind of getting dirty, making something, laughing about joy and pain. I've had some great experiences over these last couple years as Poet Laureate, because the spaces I've gone in have been so different than they usually are. I haven't been reading nearly as much in rooms of writers as I'm used to. I've been going to places where people, you know, they might love poetry and they might be sitting next to somebody who's afraid of poetry, but has come out because this is the thing that's happening on Thursday night in this small town.
Yeah.
And the sense of safety in those spaces is different. It's present, but it's about, I don't know, a tentative kind of openness. There's something, in some ways, these trips have reminded me what it felt like going to church when I was younger. Like we're in a space, someone brought something to share. Somebody brought this food, and we know each other somewhat. We might go home and talk about each other, but we also love each other somehow. I like those spaces.
And can you tell us about the rural part of your being a poet laureate, and what's so important about taking poetry into those spaces?
Well, the one motivation for going into rural communities was to listen to what other people's whose lives and values might be different from my own, what their perspectives on poems might be. So it's not, the Writers' Festival kind of audience. But the deeper motivation has had to do with this sense of a divided nation that we are being sold, I think. The idea that the red and the blue have nothing in common with each other and can't, don't speak the same language, don't even have the same blood. And I think what happens when you're arguing positions that you feel you have to defend, I think that's the outcome. But when you're coming together to listen to each other, talk about real life experiences, there's no combat. It's receptive, it's, kind. And I wanted to see what that would feel like.
And it just mirrors so much you're trying to understand your Southernness, in the ways in which you were trying to go back, and there seemed to be a way that your family was stopping you from going too far back and looking into their Southernness, and going into these rural areas, felt like the same kind of journey. You need to know what's going on, with these people. What about found poems excite you?
Before I'd ever written a found poem, I used to sometimes teach that form in workshops. And I liked that in taking language out of its intended context, you could hear different things within it. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's startling. But I never felt the need to write a found poem until I started thinking about history and researching the Civil War for a poem that I was invited to contribute to an exhibition of Civil War portraits. And the research made me see how
the poetry monster.
The research made me see how full of living, compelling, beautiful, and ongoing feeling voices, how much of history is made up of actual voices and stories. And then I realized I don't want to try and overwrite these things with my own voice and my own imagination. I want to just bring them in and and share them. So the first found poem that I wrote was it's called "I Will Tell You the Truth About This. I Will Tell You All About It," and it's made up of letters and deposition statements that Black soldiers of the Civil War and veterans of the Civil War, as well as their family members and descendants, made from the 19th century into the first half of the 20th century.
There seems to be a 3-year period in those letters, in those found poems, 1863, 1864, and 1865. Enslavement, emancipation, and then post-emancipation freedom. Was that on purpose, the way you use those 3 markers?
I think it's just how it shook out, because those were the letters that felt so urgent. I need, my masters telling me I cannot do this.
Yeah.
I need to do this. I hear that I am free. Is this true? I need to get my people.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's another source that runs through, which is I didn't get my pension. I need my pension. This is who I am. This is what I did. Or this is my father. This is my grandfather. This is, you know, this is something that they were promised, and where is it?
Yeah.
And those voices are moving in another way, because it's about this unfinished business.
Yeah, just the image of someone newly emancipated from an institution that tried to work it into the ground and kill them, then to be conscripted into the military like the next day, you know, and I think the line was, I just go from like something killing me to something else that might kill me.
We've run from out of slavery into soldiery.
Yes,
somebody said.
Yes, that was amazing. I wrote a question about holiness and writing. I experienced your writing in a transcendental way, this kind of freeing yourself from rationalism. How do you know when the writing is holy?
I feel something that isn't myself in the poems that I think are my best poems. Something I would not have had the ability to recognize. And that feels close to the holy. It feels like evidence that I've found a way to bump up against something else.
Yeah.
And sometimes that something else is the natural world, which I think, you know, lives in a lot of my newest poems. But I think that's one of our sites of the holy, and it's also imperiled by all of the things that we are doing.
Yeah.
But I like that feeling that something else is operating in the very poem I am writing.
Yeah, I like that. Does poetry speak a different language when you are writing about love?
Aren't these good? These questions, they should just... I mean, that's a poem, basically. I think the poem pulls you toward the language it needs. And love, I mean, there are lots of different kinds of loves. Most of the love poems that I've written have been about romantic love until this book. And I realized this is a book that's looking for compassion. And these poems are built of a different vocabulary than any, I think, the other poems that I've written. And I guess the love that they're channeling lives in this other register. The love that I've felt, you know, for the people in my life. I kind of think of it as different chakras or something.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's easy to write from the lower chakras about love, but then it's been exciting to try and move up and see what love sounds like from different like altitudes or something.
That's good. That's really good. Is Jean here? Oh. I'm Jean, just so you know. Tracy's sister.
If you don't know what that means, you have to buy Ordinary Light.
You have to buy Ordinary Light. It changed my life, the memoir, and the ways that you so tenderly rendered everything, every person, every couch cushion, every road, every leaf, every person, ex-lover, hurting lover, you know, girls in school you didn't like but live with. You know, how did you like just flesh them out so fully, even the ones that hurt you?
I wanted to write that book in prose so I could learn how to do that a little bit. Because in a poem I would give a gesture and leap away to something else, but telling a story meant I had to stay in place and build. And so I would let myself write the first draft and know that it was spare, too spare, but it was there. I hadn't lost it. I got the parameters of this story, and then, of a chapter. And then I would go back and say, okay, what did we eat? What did we wear? What did I smell? What didn't I ask? What was happening in that other part of the story? And with a sense of security with each, added layer, then it became so fun to kind of bring out these different dimensions.
I love the question, what didn't I get to ask? And being able to rewrite it. There is a question I had about poems being written by a Black woman. Do they say something specifically to other Black women, the poems that you write?
I think so. I think there's something quiet that might be shared or familiar. But I also think that often when I'm writing, I'm trying to get to that inner voice that I was talking about earlier. And to me, that sits beneath all of those markers of self. And so I'm hoping that I'm also touching ground at something that predates every other marker of who I am. I used to say, I'm thinking about the voice you use when you're thinking to yourself. And you don't have to identify yourself in your thoughts.
Yeah, it just made me think about code switching, and the poem that you read in public to various publics, and then the poems, how they transform when there's a room or another Black woman close to you. If that changes it.
It's exciting when somebody hears something. Like there's the title poem of Wade in the Water, which is kind of about the experience of a ring shout. There's a line, "Girl, run." And I hear that line differently when I'm in a room with people who maybe hear that in a Black way.
Yeah, that's good. In the poem History we were talking about earlier, the line about a poem with lies that would lie to you. How do you know when a poem is lying to you?
My own poem?
Yes.
It's just bad. It's trying to get away with what all the other poems I've written already did. And then I was like, girl, no.
Kind of like being the youngest child.
Yeah, it's just trifling.
Maybe there's a question about the process of becoming a writer, and writing being nurture or nature.
I think it is both, but it's probably not equal parts. I teach college students creative writing, and I know that everybody grows. I also know that some people come in with a kind of innate talent or wisdom, and they grow more. And I'm doing the same thing. I don't think that innately talented person will become a real poet without the nurture, and that sense of work. Somebody guiding you to do what you wouldn't naturally do, to read what you might not find on your own, and in the same way that a dancer is made.
Thank you so much for being in conversation with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
We have one question up here to your left.
Thanks. I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep it brief, but I have two questions. The first one is, take us from that fifth grader in Fairfield who wrote a poem inspired by Emily Dickinson called Humor to when you got to college. Talk about that period in between when you weren't quite a poet yet and you needed nurturing from whatever village was around you to realize that until when you knew it and you were on your way from that fifth grader until the BA in college, from Fairfield to there. Mm-hmm. That's my first question.
Okay, I didn't think that I could become a poet, even though that's what I knew I wanted to do, because I didn't think it was a career that still existed. Because I was reading poems by here and there, not even a lot of poetry, but by people who were long dead. I didn't know it was a living art form. So I said, I'll just be I'll be a writer somehow. I'll live an exciting life, and when I get to the end of it, maybe I'll reflect on it, and that's how I'll be a writer. And then I got to college, and I saw real living poets on campus and giving readings in town, and I remember the moment coming into the 20th century in this survey English course, one of the first English courses I took, and feeling like, that same exact feeling I'd felt as a child, and that same appetite for wanting to do that came back. And I also had peers who had the wherewithal to say, oh, of course you can be a poet. This is what poets do. You write poems, you read books of poetry, you share your work with others. And so I emulated them and found a community of people that I could, kind of emboldened me to start calling myself a poet, kind of like at 19, are you coming to this party? Oh, no, I've got to work on my poems. But that was what I needed.
Okay, and how do we as writers help you as Poet Laureate? I mean, a lot of us know we have friends who, when we talk about our poetry and they're not necessarily into it, they give us a polite smile, and then we're in the group with other writers who kind of are with us on that. But you talked about going to rural areas and going to places that you didn't normally go to, that now that you're a Poet Laureate that you have access to. How do we touch people who aren't used to poetry, who aren't necessarily connected with it? How do we connect them with that inner voice that they all have all over America, the reds and the blues and the whoever's and the people who are into poetry or who don't think they're into writing, but they really are, because we all have that inner voice. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry for the speech.
That is a great question. I think that we take ourselves and our egos out of the picture, and we emphasize what this thing is that we love, what it allows us to do. I love poetry because it helps me make sense of life. I love poetry because other people's voices can live in my head and show me things that I need to see. And when I read poems that I love in groups of people who aren't poets and who don't have a regular relationship with the art form, they like those things too. They say, this poem helps me to make sense of my own mother's death, or this poem about a family in a crisis helps me to bring language to something that happened to me. Let me tell you that story. It's a different kind of conversation than we have in like a workshop where we're thinking about the labor of making art. It's a different kind of conversation than we have when we're talking about all our publications and, prize bragging about achievement. But it's actually the conversation that is most connected to why we do what we do. And so I think just kind of remembering that is the best thing poets can do in representing the art form.
There's a question over here.
Next question on your right.
Hi. To keep it short, I'm going to make an assumption that you struggle with, at some point, maybe self-doubt or imposter syndrome as a writer, as a poet. I think all humans do, whatever they're in. How do you deal with that? What do you do? What do you say to it? The voice that's telling you you're not enough or whatever.
It's hard. I remember when I was writing my memoir, every day my husband would, come home and I'd say, look what I wrote. And then the next day I would say, oh, that's so awful, isn't it? It's so terrible. Like every day I would be either like so overjoyed by something, and then the very next day the very same thing seemed humiliating and shameful, but it hadn't changed. And I now just know this is what happens. There's this sense of elation and achievement, and then it's polar opposite, and sometimes one of those two is wrong. And,
That's good.
Go back. I think we really write because we like the work of it. And so trying to stay as close to that process is really, I think, one of the best antidotes to that fear of failure. Fear of failure is about fear of not getting praise. And that's like a side effect of writing. It's not what I think makes someone want to sit down and dig through the messy business of, feeling and sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
One more question, or we have time for a few more questions, but one up front.
I would like to personally thank you for your essence of your wonderful presence. My name is Larry Ware. I've been writing poetry and teaching over 50 years, and you both touched me deeply, like when you made mention of life-altering experiences. Last year at this time, I was on life support. I was hooked up to 15 machines, and I have nothing but love and respect for the doctors, nurses, and the hospital workers. They saved my life, and the Lord said, I got some more work for you done to do. I founded the poetry programs through the public libraries 45 years ago, and I just count my blessing that I'm hearing like a friend say, you would probably enjoy this evening, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like it's inspiring, uplifting, and motivating, and so enlightening, and like just touched my heart. And like I wrote over 100 poems while I was in the hospital. I was in so much pain, but not one day did I get depressed. I stayed positive and I prayed, and pastors, chaplains, friends, family came to visit me. First 3.5 months, they didn't think I was going to make it, but the Lord was looking out for me. He said, Larry, I got some more work for you to do. And I wanted to ask, I just kind of blessed that I'm here, but I wanted to ask you, do you remember your first poem that you wrote?
Well, thank you for coming. I do actually. I mean, I don't remember it verbatim, thank God. But I remember it because I wrote about the experience of reading a poem by Emily Dickinson and feeling like I wanted to suddenly step into that sense of authority in writing a poem, a short poem called Humor, and I wanted it to be very serious. It was in the voice of humor, and it was, commanding us to honor and respect it. It was a poem about, I think, how much laughter makes life bearable, how it helps us, right? How we need it. And I just remember the last couple lines, which are so bad, I'll share them. Treat me with respect, for I shall do you well in years to come.
Time for 2 more questions, and I invite everyone to join us afterwards for a book signing reception with Tracy. think there's a question over there.
Yep. Next question on your right.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Good evening. My name is Gregory, Brooke and Tenten. I'm a retired English, or I used to teach 9th grade English, and now I direct an after-school program at Glide. And my question, of course, is around education, students, the next generation. I feel like my generation and the ones that follow have a different relationship with literacy or reading and writing. And so I'm curious to know what you would say to the up-and-coming generations, the faces of the future, essentially what you would say to them, knowing that they really want to find an outlet or a way to express themselves, but may not always see the value in reading specifically.
Well, I feel like we learn to tell our stories, or even to identify our stories, by listening to other people's stories. You know, reading is one of the main ways that happens. And I feel like it's an kind of unbreakable chain. You've got to listen, read, and that act motivates you to answer back in a way. I think that it makes a lot of sense to teach literature with a writing component so that students can try their hand at doing what the writers that they've read have done. And I think it also makes a really big difference when students are reading in different directions. So writers, well, from teaching poetry, I know it makes so much more sense to teach poetry that is written in contemporary English so that you don't have to do this constant active translation. That becomes easier to do once you have grown comfortable with the animal that is a poem. When you know how line breaks work and you know what, descriptive language is doing in a poem, it's easier to accept that in another lexicon, another time period's voice. I think it's a good idea to teach a lot of contemporary literature so students develop a love of it and then guide them toward the voices that made that contemporary stuff possible. And writing alongside that, I think, is essential as well. And taking out those questions that we used to be asked, like, what is the message? What is is it man against man, man against nature, man? Like, forgetting all that stuff that's really just driven by tests, I think, and having conversations about literature that feel useful for life.
Good deal. We have our final question over here.
So I lied to y'all. We're going to take 2 questions, one here and one very enthusiastic one up front.
Okay.
Hello. You spoke about wanting to listen in your work with bringing poetry to rural America. I'm curious about some of the things that you've heard.
Gosh, I've heard a lot of really just beautiful things. I'll start with something kind of funny. I was in South Dakota last spring, and there's a poem I love called For the Last American Buffalo by a poet named Steve Scafidi, and it's a poem I think about, and that private self that we have. Sometimes it feels like an animal roaming, and the poet describes, the soul as a buffalo. And he describes getting close to it sometimes when you're very, lucky, touching it right here. And I remember reading that poem in South Dakota, and someone said, "You can't do that to a buffalo." Because, of course, there are buffaloes there. And so our conversation, took another turn. But I also have been really just so excited by the different ways that people have found use in poems. I've said this lots of times, but I think it's really true. Reading a poem in an addiction rehab center about love ending it's a poem about love ending, but it also allows someone to grab hold of another vocabulary for talking about the struggle of addiction. Reading poems about family in retirement center allows people to think about the past in different ways. It's amazing to me that everybody who is open to listening to a poem, reading a poem, seems able to find something useful. And it excites me because it gives these poems that I've lived with for a little while a new life in my eyes. I see that they have still more potential for use. And that overall has been the experience I've had everywhere I've gone.
Thank you. And the last question here.
Thank you. So I'm a high school student, and in our creative writing class, we pretty much exclusively studied formal poetry. And I'm not sure I agree with that decision, but sorry, Amanda. And last year, sort of poetry was introduced as a marriage in a way of form and meaning, that the form and the structure would be a vehicle for and would also complement the meaning. So I'm wondering what your relationship is to form in poetry and to sort of the shape and structure.
Mm-hmm. I believe that every formal choice drives my relationship to the content in a poem. And I feel that form exists even when you might not be able to identify it as like a traditional form. The line is a form, it's a container for something. The stanza is a container for something. The absence of those things is also a form. So all of that has an effect upon how we move through, or even how I, as a writer, am thinking and seeing the material. I turn to traditional forms when I have the most sprawling questions that need some kind of restraint and guidance. And when my thoughts seem dogged about going in a single direction and I need them to move in another direction, that's what rhyme forces, because I don't think in rhyme. And when I do, I have to be more or differently imaginative. And we all know how awful it feels to be reading a poem and then the rhyme is so obvious you could guess it. You know, like that isn't what rhyme is for. It's about pulling you in these other, better directions while also solving the problem of, the formal requirements. I don't think that's the only kind of poetry there is, obviously, but I think that it's a really great way of wrangling big material. It's also a great way of writing a poem when you feel like you don't have a poem to write. If you're obeying the rules of this form, you're going to discover you have something that you didn't realize that you had to say. It's hard, but I think it's important. When I teach traditional forms, those are the weeks that my students have breakthroughs, because their conscious mind is occupied with the recipe of the poem, and the unconscious mind says, okay, I'm going to slip in this material that's really important, and that's an exciting moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Tracy, Marvin.
Thank you. Thank you so much.